Hello?
Means those who came to the earth from deep space. Anunnaki males, in the Sumerian language, that's what that word translates as. So these alien beings began to take human females as sexual partners, and offspring were born that were another hybrid species with more Anunnaki DNA. They were referred to as the demigods, as they were not full Anunnaki quote-unquote gods, nor were they fully human. This interbreeding is described in the biblical text in Genesis chapter 6, which says, quote, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives of any of them which they chose. And the Lord said, quote, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is also mortal, yet his days shall be no more than 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men and bare children with them. The same became mighty men of old, the men of renown." Now that's a whole lot of information to take in there in just those few verses in Genesis 6. But this is a watered down recounting of the genetic hybridization and interbreeding story that is described fairly extensively in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts. So what you're seeing here is just taking all that information and condensing it down in Genesis. But the information is essentially there. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. Now what that means is after the first modification was done to the Mark I variant of the human species, because as you'll remember last week or a couple of weeks ago, I was describing the time when the first humans were genetically modified, when they were genetically created, hybridized. They could not reproduce on their own, and therefore these beings went and did a second modification, and they gave them some more of their genome, of these alien beings' genomic material, their DNA, and that enabled them to procreate on their own and gave us the current amount of chromosomes that we now have by splicing a chromosome, one of their chromosomes with one of ours. Okay, so when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, because they didn't always have that ability, all right, and daughters were born unto them, so they were at the point where they were procreating on their own, the sons of God. This means progeny of the actual Anunnaki, or these alien beings, the purebred variant of them, all right, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. The males took a liking to human females and took wives of any of them which they chose. Well, they were gods in early humans' eyes. They were our creators, our commanders, our enslavers, with seemingly supernatural capabilities and technologies. And so they just did whatever they wanted, and humanity was in no position to disagree with them at this point, especially after the further dumbing down of humanity that happened as a result of the second genetic modification that was done, which we talked about last week, which I feel is responsible for so many of the flaws and degradations in the human genome, which leads to all of the different degenerative disorders that we find in the human species, not least of which is primary psychopathy. So the next part of this quote, "The Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is also mortal." Well, what does that mean? He is also mortal. It means that these beings are mortal as well. He's talking about man, saying humanity is also mortal, just like we are. Their lifespan is thousands, possibly even tens of thousands of years. But they are mortal, and they can die. They do die. But early man would have saw them as immortal beings, because, they outstripped their lifespan by such an extent that many times, tens of generations of human beings would never see one of these beings die. That's how many thousands of years they lived for. maybe even 100 generations of human beings would never see one of these beings die. So they thought that they were immortal and never died. They just had an extremely long lifespan. That could also be as a result of interstellar space travel. When you're in a different, relativistic time frame, and especially traveling at near light speeds, who knows what their technology was, that could have, made them live extremely long on this planet, whereas they might have a relatively quote-unquote normal lifespan where they come from. I don't know. It's just speculation at this point, but it's something to consider. So he says, yet the Lord speaking here, and again, this is one of these beings, it's not the God of creation, yet his days shall be no more than 120 years. So this is, a direct allusion to the previous discussion or debate that was going on between the commanding brothers of this Earth mission, Enlil and Enki, which you have to, again, take as a grain of salt and even possibly look at as factions of these beings. I look at these two brothers not even as just individual beings. I see it as debating factions or warring factions, of these beings that perhaps the people that were just taking down these accounts, saw them as one set of beings that wanted to help humanity, one set of beings that just wanted to overtly control humanity, which is the Enlil faction, okay? And the Enki faction seems to be the ones that came up with the plan to begin with and then wanted to kind of try to uplift their progeny, if you want to even call it that, by giving them knowledge and information and trying to somehow make them capable of living in some type of harmony with each other on this planet. I don't still see either one of them as good guys. The whole thing was wrong to begin with, was immoral, and never actually should have been done. It's messing with, the actual order of nature by going in and hybridizing other beings and making things that nature didn't really select for existence. That could be debated at another time. I'm just putting out my thoughts regarding this. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean, well, then humanity would have never existed? Well, maybe that's something that people should consider may have been the natural way that things were going on this planet. Another being may have been selected to actually evolve naturally on this planet and not humanity. And then this was done. This was done to that set of beings, and they were hybridized to create us, something that it appears was actually infinitely less than what they were. But we'll get into that later. We'll continue with this story on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to What on Earth is Happening. Stay with us. Of cosmic abandonment, to try to explain the current human condition by looking at what I call the interference theory of human origins. And we're talking about these beings known as the Nephilim, and in the biblical text it says that there were giants in the earth in those days. And, people have speculated it doesn't say there were giants on the earth, but in the earth. A possible allusion or reference to these beings living in subterranean dwellings of some kind, possibly. Because again, we have to understand this was forbidden by their mission plan. And these beings were really, the commanders of these beings would not really have been very happy that this started taking place, because this created a whole new dynamic for them to have to contend with. It was bad enough that they had already created a species that basically should not have existed according to nature. And then what they did is started interbreeding with them and creating yet another species that was not intended to exist by nature. The Nephilim race. So, it says, there were giants in the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men and bare children with them. The same became mighty men of old, men of renown. So what does that mean? That means the beings that were the byproduct of this interbreeding, okay, they became what they called the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The same were these giants that were larger than normal human beings because they were essentially a cross species, an interbred species. Okay? So they are saying that they became mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, what does that mean? Okay? It means that they became the beings that were essentially propped up on pedestals as the gods that would rule over humanity. They were placed at the highest apexes of institutional power in human society. Again, we talked about this covert methodology of control by giving the human beings the institutions. Okay? They gave them money, they gave them government, they gave them religion, so that they would be more easily controllable. Okay? And now that this happened, all right, these institutions could be ruled by these interbred species, the Nephilim. They could put them in those point positions of power at the apexes of these social institutions that had already been created by humanity, and they would see them as the intercessors or the intermediaries between the gods, the actual gods, and human beings. So they were demigods, so to speak. And again, this word, Nephilim, it comes from the Hebrew language, Nephal, N-E-P-H-A-L, transliterated in English. That's how you would spell it. It comes from the Hebrew Nephal, which is Nun Pet Lamed. And that verb means to fall. It literally means to fall. Nephal, fall. The word fall is actually in the word. Okay? So Nephilim, again, Ohim is a pluralization. And you're combining basically those two things. Nephal Ohim, Nephalim, Nephilim. Okay? And that's in Hebrew spelled Nun, Pe, Yod, Lamed, Yod, Mem. Final Mem. Okay? So the word Nephilim actually means those who fell, or the fallen ones. Now here's where in religious sensibilities, when they come into the picture, you have people that believe that that word takes on the connotation that they are fallen angels, fallen ones, meaning fallen supernatural entities. Okay? Now, I can understand why people of a religious persuasion think like that, because, of course, this whole thing is dastardly and devilish by any stretch of anybody's imagination to come and create a species that is a bastardization, that is a hybridization, that you're taking off of their natural course of evolutionary development on the planet that they were adapted to. You're combining and splicing your DNA in with them to make them actually dumber, and they'll say that they were modifying them and making them better and smarter and giving them the ability to understand their language and use their tools. In my opinion, there was nothing wrong with the beings that were already living on this world, and they were developing naturally according to the natural evolutionary progression of this planet in harmony with it, and could have become something profound. And now we have been, our evolutionary development, our natural evolutionary progression has been interfered with by this genetic process, by this genetic hybridization process. That's why I call this interference theory, not just intervention. You know, they interfered with a natural process that was already taking place and was going along its way just fine. And they turned us into a being that was not adapted to naturally living on this planet, as we are really the only being, aside from the domesticated animals which we have hybridized, that are not naturally adapted to living on the surface of this planet. So, you know, it's something that we really have to explore when it comes to how people consider these beings, their nature. And you look at the whole Christian interpretation of these beings being fallen angels. But to me, this lends credence to them as somehow being supernatural entities. Okay? You know, to me, they're not supernatural entities. They're not gods at all. They're not, you know, fallen angels that were once somehow good. They're just beings like us that had technology and an understanding of, you know, how to do certain things that we didn't understand. And the word Nephal, and Nephilim, those who are fallen, to me, that's a direct reference to what happened to these beings after they started interbreeding with humanity. Since their DNA, okay, was combined with ours, they were looked at by their superiors, quote unquote, by the purebred Anunnaki as somehow diminished, fallen from their original state. Because now their DNA is combined with the human slave species DNA. And this was forbidden. Having sex with your own creation like this would have been certainly forbidden by their mission plan. That wasn't part of the deal that they basically were charged to do on this planet by their home world and the council that voted to do this hybridization to create this slave species to do the labor that they wanted them to do. So certainly this interbreeding with these beings would not have been permitted, and therefore none of these Nephilim, the fallen, okay, the ones who were less pure in their genetic code than the purebred Anunnaki, would not have been allowed to go back to their home world. They would not have been allowed to ascend to their planet, which they called Anu, or heaven. That translates in Sumerian as heaven or heavens. They could not have gone to that home world, okay, to the heavens. So they were fallen. They were confined to the earth. They were confined to this planet after this genetic interbreeding took place. Their own people, the purebred ones, would not allow them to return on their craft or by whatever means they were traveling. So hence the name, those who are fallen. They are fallen to the earth. They are not allowed to ascend back to the heavens, back to the Anunnaki home world. I mean, it just makes so much more sense if you think about the possibility of this just being off-world entities who came here through technology, rather than this being some kind of a supernatural play. Why would supernatural beings be concerned with what's going on a terrestrial world, on a physical planet? And people will speculate, well, these interdimensional or supernatural beings may use us as a food source or feed off our energy. And that's something else we have to be open-minded to and explore as well. In any event, we'll continue the ancient story of human origins and interference theory on the other side of this break. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. We'll be right back. Out there want us to believe there was a natural course of progression happening here, and then it got hijacked. It got hijacked by beings that didn't give a damn about us. And they were just using us for whatever they could get out of us. And many of them just intended to throw us away, as we'll get to, after we were used. So, again, just to wrap up this one section before we move on, the Nephilim, Ohim is like adding a pluralization to an English word, as in Elohim. Elohim is the gods. It's the word that is used for God in the Hebrew texts of the Bible. And, you ask Christians, you ask Jews, you ask, alleged people of the book, why is the name for God plural in the Bible? And there's no good answers that come back. It's not El, it's Elohim. The gods, plural gods. Okay? Because they're talking about multiple beings that were seen as gods. That's what these accounts are of. They're not talking about, in these old biblical texts, they're not talking about the God of creation. They're talking about these gods, quote unquote. Gods. And then there's the demigods that came after them, the giants, the men of renown, the ones that were in the lofty positions of authority because they were placed there as intercessors and intermediaries on behalf of the gods. And then they interfaced with human beings that way instead of showing themselves. You know? It's like, this is the God's will. You listen to us. We dictate the will of God. It sounds very familiar because that's essentially the same thing priests and government officials and judges and, you know, people at all the top level positions of earthly, quote, authority actually feel about themselves today. It's where this whole idea of divine right of kings came from, which we'll get to. They have more of the God's blood in them. Oh, they're demigods. They have more of the God's essence. You know, they have the divine right to rule over us. The gods appointed them. You know, it's where this whole notion that beings, just because of their bloodline, have some sort of a divine right to have a position of authority over others. And you just think about it, it makes so much more sense. Where would that idea have come from? That your blood and the communication of your blood through your lineage would somehow give you a right to rule over other people? People don't even consider how ridiculous that sounds when we think of kingship. And where something like that would have ever come from. Let's move on to the next slide and continue. Slide number 46. While interbreeding with the new slave species was also forbidden by the Anunnaki's mission plan, they used this to their advantage by placing these, quote, demigod offspring into positions of royalty and authority on Earth. In this way, they interfaced with and controlled the growing human population more easily. And there you see, on the right-hand side, a god, more likely than not Enki, because it has the water flowing from his shoulders. Enki was always depicted like that with fish near his head. Okay? Seated on his throne. Okay? And you have human supplicants on either side of him. And you have other beings who he's talking to and perhaps communicating his will to. That are going to go in and essentially rule on his behalf. He's going to send them down to the earth. He's not going to go and do that work himself. You know, he's an ascended one. He's one of the actual gods. You know, these beings at some point very rarely made even appearances on the earth. They let their intercessors handle their business for them. And they interacted with human beings on the earth instead of the gods. And again, hence their name, the fallen ones, those who could not ascend, those who were, you know, basically, I don't want to use the word condemned, but were, you know, they're, as part of their mission or part of their orders, they were to stay on the earth. And, you know, that could be a condemnation or a death sentence when you look at it. But in any event, these beings, you know, were considered the lineage of the gods because they had their DNA in them more so than human beings did, and hence they were seen as demigods. Eventually, in their competition to control the slave population, skirmishes and even all-out wars broke out between different factions of the, quote, gods and demigods. So they were vying and jockeying for power on Earth and resources themselves. And eventually they started going to war with themselves over territories, over resources, etc. And it was an egoic thing where they wanted to be seen as, you know, the main god. They wanted to be worshipped as these beings' god. You have to read some of the accounts of what human beings would do for these creatures. How they would see them literally as gods and treat them accordingly. You know, where every single whim was satisfied. Every, you know, you name the task, you know, they would do it for them. They would, you know, completely take care of these beings in every single way that you could possibly imagine. Bringing them whatever foods they want. Doing all their you know, physical chores for them. Sexual association and pleasuring. You name it, anything. Every single possible way that they could attend to these beings, it was done. It was like, so in many ways, while the conditions that were seen as deplorable on the earth, and these beings didn't really want to be here on this planet, they liked the conditions because they were literally treated as gods. It was like some sort of a getaway or paradise to them, because on their world, people weren't going to treat them like that. They were just normal beings. But here they were gods, with their every wish and whim fulfilled. So the ancient wars between the gods is talked about in many of these texts as well, particularly the Indus Valley tradition texts like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, etc. And some of the apocryphal books of the Bible get into that as well, like the Book of Enoch. And, you realize that these beings were simply now in a complete state of ego by this whole condition that they had created. And they liked it in many ways. Some of them didn't. Again, this Enlil faction of beings really wanted to complete the mission and get out of here. And they looked at it as a complete abomination, what had been done on this planet.